Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, we are going to be painting some Warmachine. So Steamforge Games was kind enough to send me out an early release copy of the new Warmachine two-player starter set, which features Khador and Signar. Today we're going to be painting the Khador half of the set, and so this video is more so targeted to people new to the hobby since we're painting up part of a starter set, and maybe you don't have a lot of experience with painting miniatures. So for any of my existing viewers who are maybe a little bit more familiar with miniature painting, this is going to be a little bit of a longer video because I'm not just going through and showing you what I'm doing, I'm also explaining why I'm doing what I'm doing, and also mentioning any pitfalls and such that people may run into if they're a little bit newer to the hobby. With that in mind, I did include chapter timestamps in the video so you can skip around to the various parts if you don't want to hear all of the explanation. But the video will broadly be broken up into two sections. So the first section will take you through what is commonly called the slap chop method, where you can very quickly get your miniatures painted up to a great standard using speed paint style paints. So there's minimal hard techniques that you need to learn or master in order to get a great paint job. Walk you through how to do all of that. And then the second part of the video will walk you through some, I call them advanced techniques. They're just things that you kind of have to practice, but I'll walk you through how you can take your miniatures to the next level very easily. All right, so without further ado, let's go on down to the hobby table and I'll show you how I prepped all of the miniatures for painting. All right, so let's talk about how I have prepared the models for painting, and then I will also go over some of the tools that I'm going to use. If you're following along, you're going to want to have these as well. So as you can see, I've primed all of the miniatures in black. Now, usually if you've seen any of my other videos, I like to do some sort of a zenithal grayscale to start painting from. Since this video is targeted for, newer people coming into the hobby, I didn't want to do anything that would require an airbrush. So we're going to establish that zenithal-like base priming layer using a brush. So if you don't have an airbrush, don't worry about it. We're going to show you step by step how you can create that sort of grayscale effect without one. I've also got these painting handles that I've 3D printed. They have a metal disc on the top of them, and then I've hot glued in some magnets underneath so that the model will stay attached and I can move it around, hold it upside down, however I need to in order to easily access all the areas of the mini with my paintbrushes. Now, as far as brushes go, you're going to want a really nice large dry brush. So this is a makeup style brush. The bristles are very, very soft, which helps you get a really nice smooth transition as you're applying your paint with this. Now, this is huge. This is a size 13.5, and for a good dry brush, you actually want it to be kind of big when you're working with large models like a Warjack. Now, I've also got a liner brush, and this is a size 2. It comes to a really, really sharp tip because it's used to, as it's called, draw lines. But it's also got a really nice, long, thick belly, so it'll hold a lot of paint. And unlike a lot of hobby detail brushes where the belly is really, really small and it doesn't hold a lot of paint, so you have to keep dipping into your paint to rehydrate the brush so that you can actually work with it. This, you don't have to go through that pain. It'll hold a lot of paint in the belly and you can get a lot done before you have to add more paint to the brush. And then also I've got a really nice, I believe this is a size 2 Kolinsky Sable round brush, which is a great all-arounder for, base coating and doing your basic, heavy lifting while you're painting. Now, even though this is a Kolinsky Sable brush, which is a really good natural hair brush, I got these on Amazon. They're a lot cheaper than buying some of the hobby branded brushes, where those sets will run, sometimes over $100. The set that this came from, I believe, was roughly 30. And as long as you clean them and take care of them, they will last a very long time for you. And then the last piece of kit is a wet palette. Now, this is the small Redgrass Games palette. You don't have to use this particular brand. They all mostly work the same way, where you have a sponge that holds water, and then you put palette paper on top of it, and it keeps your acrylic paints hydrated so that you can help keep them smooth and keep them workable for a very long time. So whichever brand of wet palette you go for, that's completely up to you, but you want to make sure that you have a wet palette if you're primarily painting with acrylic paints. So now we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, so to establish our zenithal, the very first thing we're going to want to do is take a mid-tone gray. So I'm using graphite from scale 75, but any equivalent brand would work. And all you're going to do is take your large dry brush and work the paint into the bristles, but you don't want the brush to be completely dry. So this technique, it works very similar to dry brushing, but it's called overbrushing. So you just want to work it into the bristles, but you still want it to be fairly wet. And then from top to bottom, you're just going to drag your brush over all of the surfaces that it can reach. So just like this, we're going to move around the miniature. Now I'm showing you this on the Warjack, but we're going to do the same thing on all of the miniatures. And as you notice, the brush stops depositing paint. You can just reload it and then keep going. So with that overbrushing step finished, you can kind of see we now have got that neutral gray in all of the high points, and then we still got black showing in the shadow areas where the brush could not reach. And it works for the infantry just as well as it does for the Warjack. So now what we want to do is take some pure white, and now we're going to dry brush, not overbrush, so that we can pick out all of the hard edges. So preparing works the same way. Just get some of that white paint on the palette. The only difference is you want the paint to be a little bit drier. And now we're going to very lightly kind of flick in a circular motion all over these outer surfaces so that we can pick out all of the hard edges and raise detail. And with that step done, our grayscale is complete. So now we can see the areas of the miniature that are in shadow are still kind of a dark gray or black. Your midtones are going to be in that kind of neutral gray. And then we've picked out all of the hard edges of the areas that will be receiving light in white. And now we've got a relatively smooth transition between those areas. An airbrush would technically get it smoother, but this still works for putting transparent paint on top of these layers and being able to use our gradient to our advantage so that we don't have to worry too much about, detailing out all of the shadows or edge highlighting as much as you would if you were just working from a solid undercoat. So now we're going to go through all of the miniatures in stages. So for these Khador miniatures, the sort of primary areas that we need to focus on, we have red armor, we've got black armor, we've got some metallics, we've got some wood, and then for all of our human characters, we also have skin. So we'll go through all of those in turn, and I'll show you how you can get them done pretty quick. First up, we're going to work on the metallics, and to illustrate the techniques that we're going to use, I'm going to use the Razor Warjack out of our kit. So you'll hear a lot of miniature painters kind of argue and talk about contrast as a way to make your minis look good. And in all of the discussions about the topic, one thing that I rarely seemed mentioned that is actually a really easy way for a beginner painter to use contrast to their advantage is to actually vary the way that you paint certain areas of your miniature. So with the metallics on the Warjack, we're actually going to paint them in two different styles. So for all of the sort of internal structural bits, I'm going to use what I like to call lazy non-metallic metal. It's not the super complex non-metallic metal that you see a lot of other people execute. I'm actually really bad at painting that, but it's using contrast style paints, speed paints, to color in those metallic bits. And then we'll use true metallic metals, so like actual silvers and bronzes and golds and stuff, to paint all of the other metallic bits on the miniature. And that gives our brains a way of very quickly, almost subconsciously, differentiating those two types of elements on the miniature, even though they're both quote-unquote metallic areas. So for the lazy non-metallic metal, we're going to hit all of those elements with Griff Charger Gray first. And this will add sort of that blued steel sort of look to all of these areas. Now, while we're waiting on that Griff Charger Gray to dry, we can move on to some of the other metallic areas. So for the rest of the bits that we want to be silver, I'm going to use Broadsword Silver from Army Painter's 2.0 Speed Paint range. And so primarily this is going to be the metallic bits of the weapon systems. It's a very nice kind of dark steel color that's very appropriate for these areas. So like the barrel on the gun, as well as this random piston that's on the bottom. And then for the few sort of silver or brass, or not silver, gold or brassy bits on the miniature, I can use Hoplite Gold, also from Army Painter, to go ahead and paint those areas while we're waiting for some things to dry. So now that we've got all of those metallic areas blocked in, we can come back to our lazy non-metallic, and we're going to add a little bit of shading to those areas with some Black Templar. But now we're going to thin this down about 50-50 with some speed paint medium so that it's not too dark and you still get some of that blued still effect coming through. So very easily all we need to do is just come back in over top of these areas and lay down some of this thinned out Black Templar. Now you can also use this mix on some of the broadsword silver areas that might need some additional shading. So like this indentation on the barrel, we can drop some in there. And then we can also run some of this into the recesses of this piston thing at the bottom of the gun. And then we can also drop some of this on the tops of the grenade launchers and give us a little bit more shading in those areas. So All of the metallics on the miniatures will kind of work in this way. Now, we used a Speedpaint Gold, so that actually does give you some shading kind of built into it. But if it's not enough, you could also run Agrax Earth Shade, would be a really good color from Citadel. Also, Skeleton Horde really works well to shade gold areas. If you wanted to add some more detail, like to the bullets or to the exhaust pipes. And as you can see with the, the silver area, by doing the chassis elements a little bit differently and more of a matte, dark blue-gray, that gives us that contrast that I was talking about just by painting those two metallic areas a little bit differently. So since we've covered the metallics, we'll go ahead and we'll move on. Now we're going to move on to working on that nice, bright, brilliant Khador red. Now, on the human figures, applying bright red Army Painter speed paint is actually relatively easy. So we're going to work on the Razor Warjack so that I can kind of show you some of the pitfalls with speed paints and how to overcome them. So one of the hardest things of using speed paint type paints is working on flat panels. And so the key to doing this well is actually just work one panel at a time. So that way you can minimize the number of brush strokes that will come through on your paint job and get really nice coverage on that one panel before you move on to the others. So we've got our layer of poppy red down, and as you can see, it does a pretty good job of covering over that grayscale. However, it is very magenta, which is not quite the Khador red that we want. The Khador red is a little bit brighter, has a little bit more orange in it. So now what we're going to do is use another speed paint, bright red, aptly named, and we're actually going to layer over our existing poppy red. So what we're going to do is mainly focus on the areas that are going to be receiving the most light. So like the shield here. And working in the same way, we're just going to go ahead and put down our new layer of this bright red. And this will tint that magenta toward that orangey red. But because we have red already down on the miniature, this is going to cover a lot better than it would over a straight white. So that layer is still drying in a couple of spots, but you can already see where it has dried that we've got way more vibrancy in our red now than what we did previously, while still getting some of the natural highlights and shadows that come with using a speed paint. Now, if you wanted even more vibrancy, you could do another layer. Even though speed paints are transparent, the more layers that you add, eventually you lose the benefit of your undercoat that we did with the dry brushing, because as you add layers, it becomes more and more opaque. So I think just the one layer of the bright red is enough. All right, so with the reds all done, now we need to handle the black areas. And so a lot of newer miniature painters, the two colors that trip them up the most are white and black. Because kind of logically it makes sense. If you want to paint black, you go grab a black paint. If you want to paint white, you go grab a white paint. What you actually want to do, because we're not painting things in a literal way, we're painting a approximation on something that's really tiny, and we need to paint them in a way that it makes sense to our eyes. So we need to be able to have shadows and highlights so that our eyes can tell, the definition and be able to discern what it is that they're looking at. So what that means is you almost never want to paint as a base layer pure white or pure black. So what we're going to do is use Occultist Cloak Speedpaint, which is a dark blue-gray. So typically, if you want to paint black on a miniature, maybe you haven't heard of the terminology color temperature, but colors can either be warm or cold. A blue-gray is going to fall into the cold category, which gives us contrast because red is a warm color. Now, there are other really dark colors that do fall on either side. So, for instance, a dark green would be considered a warm black, whereas dark blue is cold. So we're going to go with cold. And I really like this paint. It does a really great job of doing a dark gray that you can still add shadows and also have highlights. Now, as far as applying this, we're pretty much going to apply it just like we would any other speed paint. However, we do want to, again, to remember to work in sections on the Warjack so that we can avoid messy brush strokes. Here we are with the Occultist Cloak completely applied, and as you can see, a lot of the work for this particular model, this Warjack, is pretty much done. We've got all of our base coats on, and because we were using speed paints, that gave us a lot of our shadows and highlights. Now, I did want to show off some of the infantry figures that are also in the set that I've painted with the same techniques that I've been showing you guys. However, there were some additional contrast / speed paint colors that I used on these that I wanted to point out. I didn't necessarily want to paint those elements on camera and have you guys just watch the same thing over and over again, but I will let you know the colors that I used in case you like them and you want to replicate it. All right, so first up, we've got all of the wood elements, so like the halves on the axe. We use contrast Gargax Soar for those. We've also got the Warcaster's tactical rock that he's balancing on, and we just hit that with a nice simple coat of contrast Space Wolves Gray. And for all of the pouches and ammo hoppers on the miniatures, I used contrast Militarum Green. And for this guy in particular, so his missile launcher, I didn't want to use the same exact green that I used on the pouches, so I hit that with Creed Camo from Citadel's contrast line. And then any exposed skin was painted with contrast Gilliman's Flesh. And then two people have their hair showing. So the slightly darker one, I use contrast Snakebite Leather, which gives you sort of a nice, sort of light brunette kind of color. And then on the Warcaster, I use contrast Nazdrag Yellow, which gives you a sort of nice dirty blonde. Right, and then you've probably noticed these flame effects that are on some of the optional components for our character Solo here. I'm actually not going to show you guys how to paint that in this video. I've got another video that's up in the cards up here that you can watch when you're done with this, and that'll show you how I did these effects. I painted them the exact same way. In fact, that video has two different ways that you can do this. I used the contrast method from that video, which I believe is the second method. So really this is just contrast paints and dry brushing. So if this looks good to you, you can check out that video after this one, and it'll show you how to do that step by step. So with everything that we've done at this point, if you wanted to stop, base these, get your base rims painted, get some varnish on them, and start playing games, you absolutely could. I'd be more than happy to, put these miniatures on the table in the state that they're in, as sort of like a standard, tabletop quality for a relatively new painter. We've got highlights on the miniatures from using the speed paints. We've got some nice shadows. from doing our dry brushed zenithal. You know, we've got multiple colors, everything's clearly defined. You know, these will absolutely look good on a table from a couple feet away. Now, if you're interested in, you know, a couple of slightly more advanced techniques, stick around. We're going to go ahead and try to take these to the next level using some that I say advanced, but I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible to follow along, and there really aren't that many of them. So let's go ahead and get started on that. All right, so the first advance in air quotes technique that we're going to go over is edge highlighting. So edge highlighting is a very great way to add definition to your miniatures. Now, using Speedpaint style paints, you do get something of a highlight effect from, you know, properly using them and having that zenithal undercoat. So, for instance, you can see, like, on these little nubs on the knee pad, in the center of the pad we have a nice saturated red, but then on that outer ring we have kind of a desaturated orange. That orange is our edge highlight. Now, one of the downsides of using those speed paint type paints is when they go over white, white has a desaturation effect on paint. So instead of having a really nice, sharp, bright orange, we get that kind of faded, desaturated orange. And you see that across all of the speed paints that we use. So on the black areas, you know, we've got that sort of desaturated light gray with like a slight blue tint on all of the edges. So what we're going to do is correct that with normal acrylic paints so that we have really nice, sharp, saturated colors to help separate the different pieces of the miniature. Now, you don't have to edge highlight the entire miniature. You can if you know, are going for a competition piece, but for something that you're just putting on the table, typically you want to focus on the most prominent areas. So for this Warcaster, for instance, you'd probably want to focus on the face, any edges of the armor that are like toward the center of the body, maybe the shoulder pads since they're very prominent and upward facing, hands in general if they're visible, highlighting the fingers will give you a lot of detail. So things like that. Like if something's in shadow, we don't need to worry about spending extra time edge highlighting those areas. So what we're going to do, I'm going to demonstrate how to edge highlight the black areas of the miniature, and then I'll carry on, do all the other edge highlighting that I want to do, and then I'll show you the colors that I use to do it, but the techniques are going to be the same as what we're going over right now. So when you're edge highlighting, there are essentially two different ways to do it. One way is super easy. The other one honestly just requires practice. So we'll cover the easy one first. So on my palette, since our black is actually blue, we can highlight it with blue. So I'm starting out with Thunderhawk Blue layer paint from Citadel. And these layer paints are actually a very, very good consistency, usually straight out of the pot, for doing these edge highlights. And so you can get a little bit on your brush. You don't want it overloaded. And then take the side of your brush, and if you have an exposed edge, like we do here, you can just lightly run your brush along that edge, and the paint will catch there, and you get a really nice, sharp, crisp line. In other places, sometimes you actually have to draw the line. And so drawing lines for new painters can be a little difficult, because there's 4 things that go into actually being able to draw a sharp line. So 1, you have to stabilize yourself. So I know you guys can't see my body. but my elbows are on the table to minimize any shaking coming from my torso. And then if I'm holding the miniature, I'm bracing my hands together so I have as fine motor control as possible. The second thing that's going to play into this is the consistency of your paint. And this is the, art more so than science. If your paint's too thick, you're going to get a super wide line, and that's not what you want. If your paint's too thin, it'll flow too easily off your brush, and you end up with a puddle on the miniature instead of a line, and you don't want that either. So usually, like I said, the consistency of the Citadel layer paints are usually great for edge highlighting. All you need is to make sure that your brush has a little bit of moisture on it, like rinse it out, get the excess off on the back of your hand, and typically you're ready to go. Now, if you use other paint brands, you may need to thin your paint. You might need to mix it with some thicker medium. Every paint brand's going to be a little bit different. Now, the third thing that you need to worry about is brush load. So how much paint is actually on your brush. And I'll show you guys what an appropriate amount looks like. But if you have too little, it'll dry out on your brush and you can't get a lot of work done without having to go and get more paint. Or if you have too much, again, you're not going to be able to get a sharp line. There's too much paint, it's going to kind of go everywhere. The last thing, which I've never really heard anyone talk about this, it's something that expert painters, I think, kind of pick up intuitively, is how much pressure you're applying on your brush. So when you press down really hard, it causes the hairs on the brush to flare out, and you end up getting a super wide line. So you can try this for yourself to kind of practice on your palette. So you want to get to an appropriate amount of paint, which is about that. And if you push down really hard, you see you get a wide line. Now, if we reload our brush and kind of reset, and then we're really, really conscious about not applying a ton of pressure, you see that line I can get is way thinner. So you don't want to apply a ton of pressure on your brush when you're trying to draw a sharp line. Now, the other thing, so we'll call this 4B, is you want to brush with a really good tip. So this is where that liner brush that I was talking about comes in handy, because we have this really sharp tip with this long belly, so it can actually hold paint but still draw a sharp line. So let me show you guys what this will look like, and hopefully I don't screw this up on camera. Even though I've been doing this for 20 some odd years, we do still make mistakes. So again, my hands are braced, elbows on the table, so that all I'm really doing is moving my fingers, and I can draw that really sharp line just like that. So when you're highlighting, you can also do what I like to call a second stage, but this is a very sparing layer that you're really applying in a very small amount in very targeted places. So usually like sharp corners where two edges meet, or in the middle of an existing highlight. So what you're going to do is step up your color. So we started with Thunderhawk Blue for highlighting those black areas. We're now going to step up to Fenrisian Gray. So you can tell it's very, very light, so you don't want this going all over the place. So this is probably one of the few times where using this insane detail brush actually makes sense. So you just want to get a little bit of the paint and then brace yourself. And we're just going to apply a dot of this right on that corner, and then we'll get a lot of that excess off. And right in the center of this edge, we can add a really sharp highlight right in the middle. and those are going to be your highest points of reflection. So any rivets that are, going to be getting extra light, you can also highlight those in this color. All right, so I've finished up all of the edge highlighting that I'm going to do for the project. And as promised, I'm going to run through the color choices that I made just in case anyone wanted to replicate the exact colors that I used. You don't have to, though. I've shown you the technique, so you can use whatever paints that you happen to have available. But let's get started. So on the red, since Khador red is kind of a orangey red, we went ahead and highlighted with some oranges. So for our first stage highlight, we used Troll Slayer Orange. And then for our second stage highlight, we used Fire Dragon Bright. Now, I also did something that technically it's a weathering technique, but the brush control is exactly the same as highlighting, so I went ahead and did it at this point. And that's adding some scratches on the armor. So you could see some scratches here on the shoulder, and then there's a couple on the shield as well. And so I used Wild Rider Red, which is sort of in between our first stage highlight and our base color for the armor. So it wasn't so bright to be distracting, but it was light enough to where it will still show up on the armor. And a cool tip, if you make these scratches a little broad, you can then draw inside of them with a darker color. So either a dark brown works really well, or even like a dark metallic to show where there was a scratch, but it actually went the whole way through the paint. I didn't do that here, but if you wanted to, practice that, that's a really cool weathering technique. So now moving on, for all of the golds, which are primarily on the Warcaster, first I did a highlight of Citrine Alchemy, which is a super bright, really, really, really bright gold. And so to help it tie into the darker gold that I had, I went ahead and hit it with a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade, and that did a really nice job of just kind of tying that highlight into the rest of the gold. All right, so next up, we've got the silvers. So I highlighted with Ironbreaker from Citadel, and for the most part, that meant just coloring in the edges of any bladed weapon, so like here on the dagger and on the axe. But then it was also the edge highlighting on the various weapons that the hounds have. And similar with the gold, I used Nuln Oil Shade to just help incorporate those highlights into the darker metal that we had. Now, I do want to point out this is the new formulation of Nuln Oil, not the old Nuln Oil that came in a pot this sized. So this is way thinner than the old stuff. So if you happen to have the old stuff, you'll probably want to thin it down with a little bit of medium. All right, so moving on, for all of the leather bits, which are really just the weapon scabbards. First stage highlight was orange leather from scale 75. It's a nice orangey brown tone. And then for our second stage highlights, I mixed in a little bit of scale 75 Irako and really just used this to dot the studs on the leather items. And then our very last highlight, which was for all of the skin, I used scale 75 basic flesh, and that was just to lighten up the visible high points of the faces for the miniatures that aren't wearing helmets. So that's all of the highlights done. All right, so for the next technique, I'm going to show you how to do this glow effect on the Razor Warjack. So in the official paint scheme, these hollowed recesses scattered over the jack have this really awesome kind of orangey yellow glow effect. So what I'm doing is all of those areas I've filled in with Sol Yellow from scale 75, and then on the larger sections, I put a line of Teneri Yellow, also from scale 75, right down the center. And so after you get that down and you let that dry, you want to thin out a little bit of Magma Draw Flame, which is a really nice, bright, heavily pigmented orange. And you want to thin that down about 50-50. I used Army Painter Speedpaint Medium to do so. And so I've got that on my palette down here. And all you're going to do is go ahead and fill the entire cavity with that thin down contrast paint. And then very quickly wipe off your brush, get the excess moisture off, make sure you got a really nice fine tip, and then we're going to essentially draw a line right down the center, which will remove that orange contrast paint from that line of Teneri Yellow. And that's how you get the white hot center of the glow. And now you'll also notice I carried the Sol Yellow as an edge highlight around these areas just to set them off and give a little bit of a sense of depth to the miniature. Now on some of the smaller recesses, you really can't draw a really fine line of Teneri Yellow. So in those areas like here, I just put a dot of it right in that corner. And the same thing on the eyes. Toward the back, I just put a dot in that back corner. And that's the glow effect done. And for the Warcaster, I did something very similar for his eyes. So I just dotted his pupils white using this insanely fine detail brush. And then once that was dry, I came in with a little Frostheart contrast from Citadel, applied that in the eye socket, and then took my brush, washed it off, and just kind of moved that around so it acted more of a filter instead of laying down solid color. And that makes it look like his eyes are glowing and he's about to cast a spell. Alright, so I've got one more effect I'm going to show you. It requires that we go ahead and varnish our miniatures, so I'm going to go ahead, give them all a quick spray of matte varnish, and then I'll come right back and show you that last technique. Alright, so I've matte varnished all of the minis, and it's time for our final technique, which is going to be doing some glossy lens effects on some of the lensed areas of the miniatures. Now, you'll notice the miniatures are also now based. If you're curious about how to base your miniatures, if you're brand new and you've never had to do this before, check out this video up in the cards. It shows a really simple, easy way to do your bases where you don't have to actually paint them. Pretty much you just cover the base in glue, dunk it in this special mix, which that video will explain what mixes are available and where to get them, and then you just drop a little PVA glue on top to seal it in. But that's enough about the bases. We're going to talk about the lenses. So I've already done the goggles on the miniature, and we're going to do this gun sight right here. So now to prepare those areas, and it's very important that you do all of this after you've matte coated your miniature, because we want these areas to stay glossy. So if you did these first and then you put matte varnish over top of them, it'll completely ruin the effect. So after I've matte varnished the miniature, the areas where we're going to apply the effect, I put down a layer of Vallejo Model Air Chrome. Any super bright silver paint will work for this. And then now on the goggles, I use Citadel Technical Waystone Green. It's a really thick, sort of gloopy, but very transparent glossy green paint, and you just put a dot of that over top of the chrome. So I'll demonstrate here with Spirit Stone Red on the gun sight. So like I was saying, this paint is very thick and gloopy. However, you don't want to thin this out. You just want to make sure you shake up the pot real good, and then we're going to just use it straight from the pot. Get a small amount on your brush, and then all we're going to do is just tap it to the surface where we want that effect applied. And since this part is rounded, kind of just want to make sure you hit it from all the appropriate angles. And then once you're done, all you have to do is just let that dry like a standard paint, and the model is finished. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and throw up some finished photography of all of the miniatures, and we'll do the outro. All right, so here are the finished models, and I think they turned out really awesome, especially compared to the minimal effort that it took to execute these techniques. So I hope you guys learned something useful from this video, and keep practicing those advanced techniques like the edge highlighting, and it'll really help take you far in your miniature painting journey. Again, I want to thank Steamforged Games for sending me out a review copy of the kit. Really appreciate you guys, including more content creators in your acquisition of Warmachine and the rest of the Iron Kingdoms. It's great to see the game kind of get the resurgence that it deserves. If you're new and this video helped you, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button down below. Also, click that notification bell so that you don't miss any updates. Lastly, if anyone is interested in the paint brushes and the wet palette that I use, there are links down below. And that's all I've got for today, and I'll see you in the next video.